Thanks everybody for coming to this presentation and this panel. Yeah, I think you're gonna have a good one here. So late, but definitely one of the best, I think. And this is an interesting story. There's a couple things about sort of my way of thinking that I want to convey to you guys, and things about technology and innovation, and how to start with a disaster but end with a revolution, and during something like wartime, when resources are tight. And you're going to learn a few things, like things like why Jutland didn't matter, and why the Royal Navy and how they invented the aircraft carrier, these kind of things. So right off the bat, the Royal Navy's interest in naval aviation began early in the 20th century, starting with American, oddly enough, Samuel Cody, whose kite experiments set the foundation for aviation as a naval technology, a fact that was accelerated by Louis Blériot's crossing of the English Channel and winning of the Daily Mail Prize in 1909. Same year, incidentally, Charles Rolls purchased a Wright airplane on his own behalf. The British government was, however, relatively late to the game. Having turned down the Wright brothers on several occasions between 1905 and 1908, the first concrete work towards the development of naval aviation was done by Francis McLean, who donated land on the Isle of Sheppey in 1909 to the Aero Club of Great Britain for use as a pilot's training ground. This was later relocated to Eastchurch, where it was founded the primordial training establishment of the Naval Wing. Now in Germany, meanwhile, Count von Zeppelin's airship designs were rapidly improving in efficiency, promising to provide the growing German Navy with an unprecedented communications, reconnaissance, and command and control platform. High-flying Zeppelins, equipped with powerful wireless telegraphy sets, could not only see over the oceanic horizon, but could also communicate with the fleet's commander, providing invaluable intelligence regarding enemy dispositions. Something Jonathan talked about yesterday. Improvements in fire control technology only increased the theoretical value of the airships, as they could potentially provide the surface fleet with much-needed gunnery data, and thus represented the kind of technological advantage the Kaiserliche Marine needed to even up the scales against the overwhelming Royal Navy. Now, Britain's naval leadership, including Admiral Sir John Fisher, First Sea Lord until 1911, and Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty in the Asquith government, were quick to perceive this. Fisher wrote to Churchill, I quote, "Aviation supersedes small cruisers and intelligence vessels," end quote, a position Churchill took seriously. The obvious way to address the technological uncertainty surrounding the new air technology was to develop Britain's own rigid airships. Adopting such a complex and unprecedented technology, however, required sustained investment in infrastructure, cutting-edge science, and technology. The Royal Navy, as the preeminent technical organization of the British state, was well placed to address this. The Navy, after all, had already developed and integrated submarines, torpedoes, mines, wireless telegraphy, fire control systems, turbine engines, ceaseless improvements in cannon and armor, and thus the aerial dimension fit in as part of a natural progression for the Navy's technical specialists. They were doing a lot of work before the war. Now, it was Lord Rayleigh, chairman of the Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in 1908, a body including the Director of Naval Ordnance, Captain Reginald Bacon, and the inspecting captain of airships, Captain Murray Suter, who collectively recommended the development of naval rigid airships. On 21 July that year, Bacon proposed to First Sea Lord Fisher that Britain should begin the development of an airship program. Fisher immediately put Bacon in charge of the project. Now, Bacon was an experienced submarine and torpedo expert who drew inspiration from the submarine specialists he had worked with in the past, including Captain Suter. Suter's role in the airship project was to act as the Admiralty's representative with the Vickers armament firm, who were tapped to manage construction. Now, on 28 January 1909, the Committee of Imperial Defense budgeted £35,000 for the construction of the airship, plus £50,000 for the cost of the shed. This £85,000 expenditure represented little more than the cost of a single destroyer, about £80,000, and only one-fifth the cost of a light cruiser, £400,000. On 9 May, the contract with Vickers was signed and construction began. Now, progress was slow as experimental technology, over budget, and the airship was not completed until May 1911. Bacon, so valuable for leading the Navy's side of the airship project, retired in November 1909 to become managing director of the Coventry Ordnance Works, leaving Suter to take over the airship project. Now, after completion, it was found that the airship was deficient in lift, and so elements of the superstructure were removed. Now, unfortunately for the rigid airship program, the experimental duraluminum frame was wrecked when the spine split in half as the airship was being moved from its Cavendish shed on a windy 24 September. Rear Admiral Frederick Sturdy, one of Admiral's numerous critics, who I think I have on the previous slide there on the right, presided over the subsequent inquiry that was convened on 18 October, and unsurprisingly was quick to condemn the entire project as misguided. This was a near-fatal blow to the Royal Navy's rigid airship program. You can see what he wrote to Suter here, right, saying basically, yeah, don't worry about it. We're not going to blame you for everything, but this is your monster, and I'm canning it, so, forget it. good intra-service rivalry you have going there. Now, it was not until a year later that the renewed interest in airship development convinced the CID to procure several semi-rigid airships, seen here on the right, to be license built from French and German designs. Now, Vickers, meanwhile, would commence work on another full-scale rigid airship. Now, with the airship program stalled following the Mayfly disaster, the Navy began to search for alternatives. The simplest short-term solution, naturally enough, was to use airplanes. Cheap, disposable, comparatively uncomplicated to fill in for the missing airships. Swarms of small airplanes might in aggregate make up for the more expensive rigid airships. Towards this end, the protected cruiser HMS Hermes was converted to carry several seaplanes so as to simulate a rigid airship's scouting capabilities at the 1913 naval maneuvers. Now, these maneuvers exposed both the advantages and disadvantages of aircraft operating with the fleet. Captain Vivian, in command of Hermes, reported that seaplanes had difficulty communicating with warships, given their low-powered, transmitter-only portable wireless sets. And furthermore, the fragile seaplanes had difficulty ascending from the water in anything but calm conditions. Now, on the other hand, it was discovered that the seaplanes could effectively communicate with their shore naval bases and, given favorable conditions, with nearby destroyers, making them potentially a useful scouting auxiliary and even possibly useful in the anti-submarine war. Now, in October 1913, after the maneuvers, Hermes was paid off and placed in reserve, while a more permanent solution was explored. Now, rigid airship development, of course, was ongoing. So, although without the same energy notable during the years before the Mayfly disaster, Captain Suter had been removed, in fact, as inspecting captain of airships in February 1912. Not surprising. But in May, was appointed by Churchill as the director of the newly created Air Department. Suter, leading the core group of the former Mayfly designers, attempted to reinvigorate interest in rigid airships, and in fact succeeded in his efforts to secure funding for the next rigid, the R9, the contract for which was signed with Vickers in March 1914. Bad timing. The outbreak of the war frustrated these efforts, although Churchill, and after October 31st, First Sea Lord Admiral Fisher, introduced new, small Sea Scout blimps and the larger coastal and North Sea type non-rigid airships for anti-submarine work. However, they did not prioritize rigid airship development during their tenure. Now they were replaced after the May crisis of 1915 by Arthur Balfour and Sir Henry Jackson, who were firm believers in coastal defense and in fact expanded on many of the established policies and choices made by their predecessors. However, in September 1915, Balfour replaced Suter with Rear Admiral Charles Vaughan Lee, who became the new Director of Air Services. At the behest of the Grand Fleet C&C, Admiral Jellicoe, the Balfour-Jackson duo quickly resurrected the rigid airship project. Work was resumed on R9 in August 1915, and a series of rigids, the famous R-23 class, were ordered. Vickers was to build R-23 and R-26, Beardmore R-24, and Armstrong-Whitworth R-25, to be followed by 4 additional ships for a total of 8 new airships on order by January 1916. Ultimately, they would be up to 12 on order. Now, before this tumultuous series of events had taken place, we have to return to the beginning of the war. The 1913 maneuvers had shown the potential for heavier-than-air aviation with the fleet, and so the Admiralty Board appointed Vice Admiral Jellicoe, at this time still the second Sea Lord, and nominally responsible for fleet aviation, with the task of finding a suitable merchant ship for conversion to a dedicated seaplane carrier. This effort, for which 81,000 pounds was secured, commenced in May 1914, when a steamer under construction at the Blythe Yard was redesigned by John Narbeth, the Assistant Director of Naval Construction. The result of this conversion was the specialized seaplane carrier HMS Ark Royal that, upon entering service in January 1915, was immediately dispatched to the Mediterranean as part of the Dardanelles expedition. This left the Grand Fleet with only 3 cross-channel ferries, all converted, Engadine, Riviera, and Empress, which had been requisitioned from the Southeastern and Chatham Railway Company on 11 August and hastily converted into seaplane carriers during September. They did have one other ship, which was the old Cunard liner RMS Campania, purchased on 27 November before its scheduled scrapping, and commissioned as a seaplane carrier on 17 April 1915. Although additional seaplane carriers joined the fleet in driblets as the war progressed, Jellicoe, as Grand Fleet C&C, was annoyed by what seemed to him like glacial movement on the part of the Admiralty and the Air Department. With the Balfour-Jackson administration renewing airship development and Rear Admiral Vaughan Lee committed to expanding Britain's coastal air bases, Jellicoe had high expectations that his requests for air reinforcements could in fact be addressed. More than just coastal seaplanes, the Grand Fleet needed carriers. The aged Campania was constantly in for repair and only rejoined the fleet after going through several modifications on 12 April 1916. The Grand Fleet was clearly facing a naval aviation disadvantage in comparison to the High Sea Fleet with its reliable Zeppelins. To address this asymmetry, First Lord of the Admiralty Churchill had planned to use the nascent Royal Naval Air Service to degrade Germany's Zeppelin bases, a high-technology extrapolation of the Navy's traditional anti-base strategy. The feasibility of Churchill's project was demonstrated by the Royal Naval Air Service bombing raids against Dusseldorf, 22nd September and 9 October, the latter mission a great success in which Lieutenant Reggie Merricks destroyed Army Zeppelin Z-9 in its shed. The Frederikshavn Zeppelin facility was also raided without success, and other raids were conducted, including the famous Cuxhaven raid near the Williamshaven High Sea Fleet Base, early aircraft carrier strike carried out on Christmas Eve 1914, although without any success. Just have some examples of the destruction being wrought by the Royal Naval Air Service here against the dreaded Zeppelins. Now, the Grand Fleet CNC, from his vantage point aboard HMS Iron Duke, was deeply concerned as 1916 progressed. His only fleet carrier was out of commission, and his frequent requests for additional air support appeared to be going nowhere. Jellicoe worried that the Zeppelins, by providing stable gunfire spotting and communications to the High Sea Fleet, would give Germany a decisive advantage in any future naval battle. Now, although coastal defense arrangements were improving, Jellicoe was not convinced the Admiralty was doing everything it could to meet the Grand Fleet's requirements. What was really needed, clearly, were fast seaplane, or more specifically, aircraft carriers that could fly anti-Zeppelin aircraft capable of shooting down the Zeppelins. Unfortunately now, we run into the Battle of Jutland. So, as far as the development of naval aviation was concerned, the Battle of Jutland seemed to vindicate many of Jellicoe's concerns. Campania, which was equipped with 10 seaplanes, received the CNC's orders to prepare to sortie at 5:35 p.m. on 30 May. However, traffic caused while the fleet was leaving Scapa Flow delayed Campania, and the carrier's commander, Captain Schwann, was unable to depart harbor until after 12 a.m. on 31st May. Now, sailing without destroyer escort in U-boat-infested waters was a non-starter for Jellicoe, and so he ordered Campania back to Scapa Flow at 4:37. The Grand Fleet, as a result, went into battle without the battle fleet's only aircraft carrier. Captain Schwann also missed Admiral Schur's August sortie, as the aged Campania was once again laid up for repairs. This is a lesson about making sure you've got new technology, certainly, or at least technology that's modern as opposed to trying to resurrect old hulks. HMS Engadine, however, under Lieutenant Commander C.G. Robinson, did, however, sortie from Rosyth at 10 p.m. on 30 May alongside the rest of the battlecruiser force, and the seaplane carrier indeed played a small role in the battle. Just after 2:40 p.m., Vice Admiral Beatty, commanding the battlecruisers aboard HMS Lion, ordered Engadine to perform seaplane reconnaissance to the northeast. Now, what turned out to be Engadine's only sortie at Jutland was flown by Flight Lieutenant F.J. Rutland with Assistant Paymaster G.S. Trewin, who utilized their short 184's 60-mile range Resolute wireless set to transmit contact reports back to Engadine. Although the contact reports were received, they were not transmitted on to Beatty at the battlecruiser fleet, which meant, unfortunately, that they were not terribly useful. Of course, it didn't matter in the end because HMS Galatea had already spotted the approaching German fleet. So ended the role of naval aviation in the Battle of Jutland. So not much happening there, but then again, Jutland didn't matter anyway. So, new airships. The Jutland experience left much to be desired, although the promise of naval aviation had been demonstrated under battle conditions nevertheless. Jellicoe was still keen to receive rigid airships, more reliable and stable than their airplane counterparts he hoped. On 24 September 1916, Zeppelin L-33 was shot down over Essex, and an investigation of the wreck demonstrated that the Air Department's existing rigid airship designs were woefully obsolete. This meant that, of course, what was really needed was reverse engineering. The result was the R-33 class, to which progressive improvements were made up to R-41, which was ordered in June 1918. The much delayed and now technically obsolete R-9 was at last inflated in November 1916, but like the Mayfly before it, was found deficient in lift and was thus lightened over the winter, finally becoming operational early in April 1917. It was used mainly for training purposes. R-26 and its successors entered commission on a monthly basis between March and July 1918, but were used exclusively in the training and anti-submarine roles rather than for fleet operation. The advanced R-33, built by Armstrong, was finally accepted into the Navy and deployed to East Fortune on 29 May, along with its sister ships, but this war was already rolling down at this point. By the time R-33 and its sister ships were finally commissioned, it was unlikely that they would have any use for the Grand Fleet, which was being dispersed, in fact, to fight the submarine war. So conditions had changed by this point. Furthermore, anti-Zeppelin explosive ammunition had been developed, which I would argue made airships basically technologically obsolete, at least for military purposes, given how dangerous it would be to fly in a huge hydrogen balloon when somebody's shooting exploding bullets at you. Well, the airship force was building up during 1917. The Grand Fleet still faced the capability gap. At the beginning of the year, Jellicoe departed for the Admiralty as First Sea Lord, with a mandate to counter the submarine crisis. Admiral Beatty succeeded Jellicoe and brought a renewed determination to address the Grand Fleet's inadequate naval aviation force. The Grand Fleet battle orders that BD inherited from Jellicoe provided for seaplane reconnaissance and kite balloon gunfire spotting only. Didn't have the resources he needed to really go beyond this. This was understandable, as the entire Grand Fleet at this time possessed only 24 aircraft, 12 reconnaissance seaplanes and 12 anti-Zeppelin fighters carried aboard Campania, Engadine, and Manxman. HMS Nirana and Pegasus, additional converted ferries, were added to the fleet as a stopgap, but what was desperately needed were dedicated carriers, capable of launching and recovering aircraft. To address the lack of dedicated carriers, BD convened the Grand Fleet Air Committee under the chairmanship of Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas, previously 5th Battle Squadron Commander. After a month of meeting, the Air Committee presented its reports on 5 February 1917. BD forwarded the report to the Admiralty, where it was circulated for comment during the first week of March, and the most significant contribution that the Air Committee made was recommending the conversion of HMS Furious, then still under construction, to work as an aircraft carrier. Furious was a fast, light battle cruiser armed with, I believe it was 18-inch cannon, but would be much better served in the role as an aircraft carrier, as it could keep up with the battle fleet and indeed the battle cruiser fleet. Now on 26 June, finally, Furious was added to the Grand Fleet under the command of Captain Wilmot Nicholson, with the experienced Squadron Commander E.H. Dunning as his senior flying officer. Yes, now Furious was equipped to carry 3 short 184 planes and 5 Sopwith pups. Would have been very useful at this early phase, but as we can see on the right, Dunning was tragically killed on 7 August while landing on Furious's foredeck. This shows you, I think, an important lesson, which is if you have key people like this and you lose them, you're going to have trouble rebuilding that capability. So after Dunning's death, the landing on the carrier foredeck was suspended, and on 14th November, Furious returned to dockyard for additional modifications, namely the development of a landing deck on the rear stern. Now, while Furious was undergoing its second modification, and with the rigid airships now nearing completion, BD believed the Grand Fleet should consider the proposals that were floating around calling for a naval airstrike against the High Sea Fleet base at Wilhelmshaven. This ambitious effort to use naval aviation to shape the war in a strategic sense had at its core the objective of disrupting the High Sea Fleet's ability to protect Germany's U-boat bases. If the German battle fleet could be crippled in harbor, it would free the Grand Fleet to execute a closer blockade and perhaps even cover amphibious operations against the U-boat bases themselves, which is the only way to really take U-boats out, unless you can sink them, which is almost impossible to do during the First World War because you can't find them. Now, there were a number of experienced naval practitioners, including Commodore Suter, Flight Lieutenant Rutland, now of Jutland, 3rd Sea Lord Rear Admiral Lionel Halsey, Captain Herbert Richmond, Flight Commander Williamson, and BD himself, who endorsed this concept of operations. BD, eager to generate some offensive action, together with Jellicoe and senior Grand Fleet personnel, discussed the proposal aboard Queen Elizabeth on 24 August 1917. BD recalled that Rutland had suggested methods for a Wilhelmshaven attack, and shortly afterwards, BD met with Richmond, and together they endorsed the plan. With strong backing from the Young Turks, BD went to London to discuss the plan with the Admiralty leadership. On 11 September, he submitted a detailed proposal requesting no less than 120 torpedo planes launched from 8 converted merchant ships. Unfortunately, this was also the climactic phase of the submarine crisis, and he simply wasn't going to get these resources. Furthermore, the torpedo plane they needed, Sopwith T-1 Cuckoo aircraft, known for dropping its eggs in other people's baskets, was first, or nests rather I should say, was first delivered only in April 1918. So he simply didn't have the material for this. Although the visionary Wilhelmshaven plan ultimately fizzled out, it did emphasize the need for improvements in the material conditions of the Grand Fleet's aviation, including what was about to take place, which was the development of the Flying Squadron. The formation of the Flying Squadron stands out as the culmination of the Grand Fleet's naval aviation revolution. BD was encouraged by recommendations, specifically from Rear Admiral Richard Fillmore, and decided to centralize the Grand Fleet's aviation assets into a single unit, separate and distinct from the planning then underway for the Wilhelmshaven strike. Fillmore became Rear Admiral Air, and then shortly after that, Admiral Commanding Aircraft, and moved his flag from HMS Repulse to Furious itself. Now, BD, in fact, had pulled off a major coup. He had been informed by the decision of the War Cabinet on August 1917 that the Air Ministry was about to be formed, which happened in January 1918, followed by the creation of the RAF itself in April 1918. And knowing this, needed to get control of his naval aviation assets before they all disappeared off to the Air Ministry. So, by bringing Fillmore in, he was able to make sure that the future RAF officers stayed under his control. On 15 March 1918, the modifications to Furious were complete. Fillmore transferred his flag from Repulse to there. And Furious now had a 208-foot landing deck, although landing trials proved, in fact, that it was still too difficult to land successfully. Now, Furious was being completed, and new developments were happening, such as the development of the Conto Rosso liner into HMS Argus, flush deck, And you can see just various images here, including the preparations for the Tondern raid there on the right, plans for Furious here, and a nice picture showing the fleet group operations with Furious. Fillmore was supported by a decent team, very good team actually, Robert Clark Hall, Richard Bell Davis, who set to work devising an attack plan to go after the Tondern Zeppelin sheds. The operation was to commence at 3 a.m., and the Sopwith fighters would fly in carrying 50-pound bombs and destroy the sheds, which is in fact what they did in Operation F7, oddly enough the same room that we're in right now for this presentation. Right? Beatty provided Fillmore with the latest information. Furious task force was assembled, supported by light cruisers and battle cruisers, and at 3 a.m. on 18 July, Furious was prepared to launch its aircraft, but Fillmore made the decision to delay for 24 hours due to a thunderstorm. Second attempt on 19 July succeeded, and the Sopwith aircraft went in, destroyed Zeppelins L-54 and L-60 in their sheds, which was a spectacular success for the Naval Aviation Force, even though it was now under the control of the RAF. Now I sort of have to, I've got to conclude, right? So unfortunately we've got to kind of skip over some of these developments with Argus, very important. You can see just the landing trials happening here. And the important thing, really the key important thing here, is that the Sopwith Cuckoos are now coming into play. This is now going to give the Grand Fleet under Beatty the ability to go strike the Wilhelmshaven Fleet Base over the protective minefields. Now there's further developments, obviously. They start putting planes on the turrets. They cover the whole fleet in aircraft. I just give you the numbers. Let's see, 165 air and seaplanes carried organically by the fleet towards the end of the war. So, at long last, they're ready to do Wilhelmshaven. They've got the plan, they've got the people, they've got the ships, they've got the aircraft. It's ready to happen. And what happens? Well, the Grand Fleet mutinies, the High Sea Fleet mutinies, and the war ends. So it's not pulled off. However, you can see they were not happy about this. The naval aviators. The Huns surrendered. How annoying. We were about to totally destroy them, or at least cripple them in harbor. So, to conclude, wrap this one up, although the Wilhelmshaven plan doesn't come out, and this does not take place, the concept is in fact demonstrated the following year on 6 September 1919 during naval maneuvers in which the torpedo bombers do successfully attack the British Atlantic Fleet's battleships and are believed to have scored a major success. Flying Squadron is disbanded, and the rest, as it is history. And I'll leave that to my colleagues to tell you more. Thank you.